Unfair action. Letters that would have intimidated a less organized family only fueled their resolve. They realized that they were no longer just trying to survive in the neighborhood. They were beginning to understand the power of standing up for themselves quietly but firmly, and that the coming conflict could teach the entire neighborhood an important lesson about fairness and courage. By the end of that first part of their story, it was clear that the Millers and Karen were on a collision course. One believed she could dominate with rules and intimidation. The other believed in standing up for what was right, armed with careful planning and determination. The neighborhood watched silently, aware that the tension was only growing, wondering who would bend, who would fight, and who would ultimately prove that fairness, not fear, could win the day. The tension in the neighborhood only grew after the first year. The Millers had learned quickly that living under Karen's watchful eye was exhausting. Every day felt like walking on eggshells. A small action, like watering the garden too early in the morning or leaving a window open a little too long, could trigger a complaint. Karen had become relentless. She sent emails, letters, and sometimes even spoke directly to neighbors to gather support against the Millers. Her approach was aggressive but calculated. She wanted the Millers to feel constantly scrutinized and hoped they would eventually give in and accept her rules without question. At first, some neighbors quietly tried to help, offering advice or lending small bits of moral support. But Karen had a way of isolating anyone who opposed her. People who spoke up sometimes found themselves on the receiving end of her criticisms. Some neighbors stopped attending HOA meetings because they didn't want to deal with her pressure. Others felt powerless, thinking Karen had too much influence. The Millers noticed this and realized that if they wanted any chance of standing their ground, they couldn't rely on support from the board or neighbors. They would need to rely on themselves, careful preparation, and evidence that couldn't be ignored. The Millers began documenting everything in detail. Every letter from Karen, every fine, every complaint was recorded and stored carefully. They photographed their lawn and garden weekly, making sure they had proof that their property met all regulations. They even took notes on the timing of deliveries, maintenance work, and trash pickup. While it seemed obsessive at first, this attention to detail gave them a sense of control. They could no longer rely on assumption or trust that things would go smoothly. In a way, the preparation became a shield, giving them confidence against Karen's relentless attacks. Karen, meanwhile, believed her campaign against the Millers was unstoppable. She often spoke about them in HOA meetings, presenting a carefully polished narrative of rule violations and disrespect. She framed herself as a protector of the neighborhood, someone ensuring that everyone complied with the rules. Some neighbors nodded along politely, fearing confrontation. Others secretly doubted her, but most remained silent. Karen's confidence grew with every meeting, every letter, and every fine she issued. In her mind, she had already won. The Millers began to notice that the letters and complaints were escalating in severity. Minor infractions turned into accusations of intentional wrongdoing. A small deviation in garden layout became a serious breach of HOA rules. A delayed trash pickup was framed as negligence. It became clear that Karen was not merely enforcing rules but creating problems where none existed. She was testing the Millers, seeing how much pressure they could take before giving in. But the Millers refused to bend. They were determined not to let fear or intimidation dictate their lives. As the months passed, the Millers' daily routines adjusted to Karen's scrutiny. Even simple acts like having friends over or children playing outside required careful planning. They made lists and schedules to ensure that nothing could be interpreted as a violation. It was exhausting, but they saw it as necessary. They also realized that being calm and collected in the face of harassment was their strongest weapon. Any display of frustration could be used against them, so they practiced patience and responded only with facts. Their goal was not to fight emotionally but strategically, building a clear case that showed Karen's behavior as unreasonable and excessive. Karen, on the other hand, did not realize that the Millers were documenting everything. She continued her attacks with the same confidence, assuming that pressure alone would break them. Her letters became increasingly demanding, sometimes even threatening legal action. She hoped that the stress would eventually cause the Millers to make mistakes or react emotionally. She was unaware that every word she wrote, every action she took was being carefully recorded, building a file that could prove her misconduct. The Millers also reached out quietly to a few neighbors who had witnessed Karen's behavior. They gathered statements from people who had seen her confront other homeowners, demonstrating a pattern of intimidation and overreach. These neighbors were hesitant at first, fearing retaliation, but many felt compelled to speak after seeing the Millers' calm and factual approach. Slowly, a network of quiet witnesses began to emerge, people who could confirm that Karen's actions were not justified, but were instead part of a larger pattern of harassment. The Millers knew that relying on witnesses and documentation alone might not be enough. They began researching the legal side of HOA disputes. They wanted to understand exactly what rights they had as homeowners, and what limits existed on an HOA board member's power. They discovered that while HOA boards have authority to enforce rules, there are strict limits. Harassment, false accusations, and misuse of authority were not allowed. Knowing this gave the Millers a renewed sense of purpose. They realized that Karen's confidence, while intimidating, was built on a misunderstanding of the limits of her power. They now had the tools to challenge her actions effectively. Life in the neighborhood became a careful balance of caution and resistance. The Millers maintained their daily routines while also preparing for what could become a legal battle. They continued to document, gather witnesses, and consult experts. At the same time, they tried to keep a sense of normalcy for their children, encouraging them to play and enjoy their home despite the tension outside. It was not easy. The constant monitoring, the letters, and Karen's frequent presence in meetings created stress, but the family supported each other and refused to let fear take over. Karen, for her part, remained unaware of the Millers' growing preparation. She continued her attacks with the same intensity, certain that she could overpower them through authority and intimidation. Her letters grew more frequent, her tone harsher, and her actions more aggressive. She sometimes bragged in HOA meetings about her success in maintaining neighborhood standards, not realizing that her campaign was slowly creating an enemy who would not be ignored. Her overconfidence blinded her to the fact that persistence alone could not guarantee victory if the other side was prepared and informed. The Millers' efforts began to pay off in subtle ways. They noticed that some neighbors were quietly observing the situation with renewed interest. Karen's aggressive tactics, which she thought would intimidate everyone into submission, were instead drawing attention to her behavior. People started whispering about how extreme her actions were. Some neighbors, who had remained silent out of fear, began to feel that perhaps the Millers had a point. This shift in perception gave the Millers confidence that they were not alone, even if the support was still quiet and cautious. As the months turned into another year, the Millers realized that this was not just a personal struggle, it had become a community issue. Karen's approach affected not only them, but also how other homeowners felt about the neighborhood. Some residents started questioning the fairness of the HOA, wondering if Karen's influence was too strong, and if other people might suffer in the same way if they did not comply perfectly with her expectations. The Millers' struggle highlighted a larger problem, one that extended beyond individual grievances to the very heart of how the neighborhood operated. The Millers remained steadfast, knowing that any misstep could give Karen ammunition. They responded calmly to each complaint, corrected issues when necessary, and always backed up their actions with evidence. They were patient, understanding that a long-term approach was required. While Karen acted on impulse and emotion, the Millers acted with strategy and reason. They were no longer reacting out of fear but responding with clarity, determination, and precision. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior became even more aggressive. She began attending more meetings, speaking louder, and sometimes confronting neighbors directly in ways that seemed designed to intimidate. She underestimated the Millers' resilience, assuming that her reputation and authority would continue to protect her. But every action she took, every letter she sent, and every meeting she dominated was another piece of evidence that the Millers could use. Her overconfidence was, in fact, her greatest weakness. By the end of this period, it was clear that the Millers were no longer just homeowners trying to comply with the rules. They had become strategic defenders of their home, quietly preparing for a confrontation that would eventually take a much bigger stage. They knew that Karen's confidence and aggression could not continue unchecked if they wanted peace in their home. They also understood that a fight for fairness required calm persistence, documentation, witnesses, and knowledge of their rights. The Millers' story had already begun to attract quiet attention in the neighborhood. People noticed how calmly they handled each situation, how organized they were, and how politely they responded to harassment. This contrasted sharply with Karen's aggressive style, making it increasingly clear to neighbors that her behavior was extreme. Even those who had once feared her began to whisper about whether her authority was being misused. The tension was no longer just between the Millers and Karen. It had begun to ripple through the neighborhood, creating a subtle but noticeable shift in perception. Karen's confidence, once unchallenged, now faced an invisible but growing resistance. The Millers' determination and preparation had become a quiet threat to her assumed control. She remained unaware, thinking she was leading the charge, while in reality, the Millers were laying the groundwork for a decisive challenge that would reveal the limits of her power. The Millers understood that patience was critical. They did not need to confront Karen directly yet. Their strategy relied on building a solid foundation of evidence, witnesses, and understanding of the law. They responded with facts, not anger. They stayed calm, kept records, and remained polite, turning Karen's aggression into material that would later demonstrate her overreach. Their goal was not to win a popularity contest, but to protect their home and family from unfair harassment. By the time Part 2 concluded, the Millers had transformed from anxious newcomers into determined defenders. They had gained control over what they could, learned to respond strategically, and quietly gathered support and evidence. Karen, oblivious to the growing threat, continued her campaign of intimidation with the same confidence, unaware that her actions were building the very case that could one day challenge her authority. The stage was set for the next chapter, where the conflict would escalate, tensions would rise, and the quiet battle between fairness and aggression would become impossible to ignore. By the time the third year rolled around, the tension between the Millers and Karen had reached a level that could no longer be ignored. What had started as minor complaints and letters had escalated into a full-blown campaign of harassment, and it was becoming clear to everyone involved that this was not just a neighborhood dispute. It was a fight for fairness and respect. The Millers had grown stronger, more organized, and far more strategic. Karen, on the other hand, remained confident in her position, convinced that her authority and knowledge of HOA rules made her untouchable. The Millers spent countless hours reviewing their documentation, going over every letter, email, and photo they had collected since moving in. They had organized everything meticulously, creating a timeline of Karen's actions that showed a clear pattern of intimidation. Each fine she had issued, each complaint she had sent was logged with dates, details, and evidence of whether it was justified. In doing this, they were not just protecting themselves, they were preparing for a confrontation that they hoped would finally put an end to the harassment. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign with the same relentless energy. She attended every HOA meeting, often arriving early to ensure she had the best seat and the most attention. She dominated discussions, frequently interrupting others to make her point. Her letters to the Millers had become almost daily, each one more aggressive than the last. Sometimes she even went directly to neighbors, asking them to support her claims against the Millers, framing herself as the defender of the neighborhood's standards. Most neighbors stayed silent, afraid of becoming her next target, while a few watched with growing concern. Despite the pressure, the Millers refused to be intimidated. They continued responding calmly to each of Karen's letters, correcting any minor issue immediately while keeping detailed records of every interaction. They also began to reach out quietly to neighbors who had witnessed Karen's behavior. Some neighbors were hesitant to get involved, fearing retaliation, but others were willing to provide statements about what they had seen. These accounts confirmed a pattern that the Millers had suspected. Karen was not simply enforcing rules. She was creating problems where none existed, and pushing for punitive measures that were far beyond what was reasonable. The Millers also consulted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. They wanted to understand their legal rights and how to approach the situation in a way that would be effective without escalating conflict unnecessarily. The lawyer explained that while HOAs have authority to enforce rules, they do not have unlimited power. Harassment, intimidation, and misuse of authority were grounds for a legal challenge. This information gave the Millers confidence. They realized that Karen's overconfidence could be her undoing. She was relying on fear and intimidation. But if the Millers approached the situation strategically, they could protect themselves and expose the limits of her authority. As the Millers prepared, Karen's behavior became more extreme. She seemed to take pleasure in the discomfort she caused, viewing each response from the Millers as a challenge to be overcome. She sent letters that threatened fines, legal action, and even public shaming in HOA meetings. She scrutinized every detail of their property, every minor deviation from the rules, and seemed to enjoy pointing out perceived flaws in front of other neighbors. Her confidence was unshakable, but it was also becoming reckless. One evening, the Millers gathered in their living room to discuss the next steps. They knew that Karen's aggression would not stop on its own. The Millers' oldest child asked why Karen was always so angry, and why she seemed to take pleasure in making people anxious. The parents explained that some people try to control others because it makes them feel powerful, but it doesn't mean they are right. They reassured their children that by staying calm, collecting facts, and seeking support when necessary, they could protect themselves and their home. This conversation reminded the family why they were fighting. It was not about winning against Karen personally, but about creating a safe and fair environment for everyone in their home. The Millers also began attending HOA meetings more regularly, not to confront Karen directly, but to observe and gather evidence. They listened carefully to discussions, took notes, and spoke quietly to neighbors who were willing to offer insight. They noticed how Karen dominated conversations, often framing her complaints in ways that made her seem reasonable while intimidating others into silence. But the more the Millers observed, the more they realized that her influence had limits. Not everyone agreed with her, and there were quiet whispers of dissent among some board members who had begun to question her methods. One day, Karen noticed a small error in the placement of the Millers' recycling bins. She sent a letter demanding immediate correction, along with a fine for what she called habitual non-compliance. The Millers took the letter calmly, corrected the placement immediately, and filed the correspondence in their growing evidence folder. They did not respond with anger, even though they felt frustrated. Their lawyer had advised that maintaining a calm, factual approach would be far more effective than reacting emotionally. The Millers knew that every reaction from Karen was meant to provoke, and they refused to take the bait. As the Millers' preparation continued, some neighbors quietly began to notice the contrast between the two approaches. Karen's aggressive tactics, which she thought would intimidate everyone, were instead highlighting her extreme behavior. The Millers' calm and organized responses stood out, making them appear reasonable and measured. People started to whisper about whether Karen's actions were appropriate and whether the HOA board was allowing one individual too much influence. This shift in perception gave the Millers hope that they were not alone, even if support was still cautious and limited. Karen, unaware of the growing concern among neighbors, continued her campaign with the same intensity. She sent emails late at night, visited homes to inspect minor details, and called meetings to discuss supposed violations. She believed that persistence alone would eventually force the Millers to submit. But persistence without evidence or reason was no match for a family that had prepared carefully, documented every action, and built a network of quiet witnesses. The Millers also took steps to protect themselves from potential legal overreach. They made sure that every response was polite, factual, and supported by evidence. They avoided personal attacks even when Karen's letters became aggressive or insulting. They knew that maintaining professionalism and clarity would strengthen their position if the situation eventually went to court. Each day, each letter, each observation became another piece of the puzzle they were assembling, a puzzle that would eventually reveal Karen's pattern of harassment. Despite the ongoing stress, the Millers tried to maintain normalcy in their lives. They encouraged their children to play outside, invited friends over, and continued to enjoy their home. It was not easy. Every activity required careful planning to ensure it could not be misinterpreted as a violation. But they understood that giving in to fear would only allow Karen to dictate every aspect of their lives. By maintaining a sense of normalcy, they were asserting control over their home and their family's well-being. Karen, in her confidence, did not see the long-term consequences of her actions. She believed that her authority was absolute and that fear alone would ensure compliance. She did not consider that the Millers were building a case, gathering evidence, and quietly preparing to challenge her. Every letter she sent, every fine she issued, and every aggressive meeting she dominated was strengthening the Millers' position. Her overconfidence blinded her to the fact that persistence without fairness or reason could be her undoing. The Millers also began preparing for the possibility that legal action would be necessary. They discussed what steps they would take if Karen continued to escalate, how they would present their evidence, and how they could protect their rights as homeowners. They spoke openly as a family about the importance of standing up for themselves while remaining calm and factual. This preparation gave them a sense of empowerment, turning what had been a stressful and frightening situation into a challenge they could face strategically. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior began to attract more attention outside the immediate neighborhood. A few neighbors who had previously been silent began to question her actions publicly. They wondered whether her influence on the HOA board was appropriate and whether her aggressive tactics were creating a hostile environment. Although many were still hesitant to speak openly, the shift in perception signaled that Karen's power was not as absolute as she believed. The Millers observed this quietly, recognizing that the community might eventually support them when the time was right. As the months passed, the Millers' confidence grew. They had transformed from anxious newcomers into strategic defenders of their home. They knew that patience, preparation, and calm responses would be their strongest tools against Karen's aggression. They continued to document every interaction, gather witness statements, and consult legal advice. Each day brought new challenges, but it also reinforced the importance of standing firm and responding strategically rather than reacting emotionally. Karen, for her part, remained oblivious to the growing challenge. She continued her daily patrols, her letters, and her meetings with the same intensity, certain that she would eventually force the Millers to comply. She did not realize that her overconfidence, her aggression, and her reliance on fear were actually creating the conditions for a decisive confrontation. Each action she took added to the evidence the Millers were collecting, building a record that could not be ignored. By the end of Part 3, the neighborhood had changed in subtle but important ways. The Millers had become a symbol of calm, strategic resistance in the face of harassment. Karen remained aggressive, confident, and unaware of the growing support for the Millers among neighbors. The stage was set for a confrontation that would eventually bring the situation into the courtroom, where evidence, preparation, and fairness would finally be tested against aggression and overconfidence. The Millers were ready, and Karen, despite her certainty, was walking unknowingly into a challenge that would put her authority to the ultimate test. The tension had reached a boiling point. The Millers had spent months preparing for what they knew was inevitable, a confrontation that could not be resolved through letters or meetings alone. Karen's relentless attacks, her constant scrutiny, and her aggressive letters had created an environment that was impossible to ignore. The Millers had collected evidence, documented every incident, and quietly gathered statements from neighbors who had witnessed Karen's behavior. They now felt ready to take the next step, knowing that their fight for fairness would soon move into the courtroom. Karen, on the other hand, remained completely confident. She believed that her authority on the HOA board, her knowledge of the rules, and her ability to intimidate others meant that she would prevail. In her mind, the Millers had no chance. She continued her daily patrols of the neighborhood, checking every house and yard for violations and sending letters that seemed more aggressive with each passing week. She believed she was the protector of the community, the person who ensured that rules were followed, and anyone who questioned her authority was simply wrong. The Millers received word that their lawyer had prepared all the necessary documents to file a formal complaint. They were nervous but determined. They knew that taking legal action would escalate the conflict, but they also knew that it was the only way to stop Karen's harassment. For months they had endured stress, sleepless nights, and constant anxiety about minor actions being scrutinized. They wanted peace in their home, and this step was necessary to reclaim it. The day of the initial hearing arrived. The Millers dressed carefully, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy despite the nerves. Their children, though too young to fully understand, could sense the tension and clung a little closer than usual. The family walked into the courtroom together, each step reinforcing their determination. They were not just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for the right to live in their home without fear. Karen entered the courtroom with the same confidence she had carried into every HOA meeting. She wore a sharp expression and carried folders filled with her carefully organized letters, fines, and complaints. She expected the process to be quick, believing that her evidence and her position on the board would ensure a favorable outcome. She greeted the judge with a confident nod, unaware that her overconfidence could be a weakness. As the hearing began, The Miller's lawyer presented the evidence they had meticulously gathered. Letters, emails, photographs, and witness statements were laid out in a clear timeline, showing a consistent pattern of harassment. Each complaint Karen had sent was analyzed, revealing that many were exaggerated or entirely unfounded. The lawyer explained how Karen had misused her position on the HOA board to intimidate and control the Millers. Going far beyond the scope of reasonable enforcement, Karen attempted to respond, presenting her folders of letters and fines. She spoke confidently, insisting that she had simply been enforcing the rules and protecting the neighborhood. She portrayed the Millers as difficult and uncooperative, hoping to sway the judge with her assertiveness. But as the evidence was reviewed, it became clear that her actions were not about rule enforcement. They were about control. Each document she presented, each threat she made, highlighted the very behavior the Millers had been preparing to expose. Neighbors who had been quietly watching throughout the hearing whispered among themselves. Some had attended to support the Millers, others out of curiosity. As the evidence was laid out, it became clear to everyone present that Karen's reputation for strict rule enforcement had overshadowed the reality of her actions. She was not merely a vigilant neighbor. She had created an environment of fear, using her position to push the Millers into submission. The courtroom atmosphere grew tense, and Karen began to realize that the confidence she had relied on for so long might not be enough. Witnesses called by the Millers described their experiences with Karen in detail. One neighbor spoke about a time Karen had aggressively confronted her over a mailbox that was only slightly misaligned, threatening fines and legal action. Another recounted how Karen had monitored their property for weeks, documenting every minor deviation from HOA rules. Each statement painted a picture of behavior that went far beyond reasonable enforcement. The Millers' lawyer emphasized that these incidents showed a pattern of intimidation, harassment, and misuse of authority. Karen tried to interrupt witnesses, speaking over them and insisting that their memories were flawed. She attempted to frame her actions as necessary and justified, but each interruption only highlighted her aggressive tactics. The Millers remained calm, listening to each statement, knowing that patience and composure were their strongest allies. Their strategy had been to present facts and evidence, not emotions, and it was working. The contrast between Karen's aggressive, sometimes emotional defense and the Millers' measured approach was stark. As the hearing progressed, Karen's frustration grew. She had expected an easy victory, confident that her knowledge of the HOA rules and her board position would be enough. She did not anticipate the level of preparation the Millers had undertaken, or the quality of the evidence they presented. Every letter, every photo, every witness statement chipped away at her confidence, exposing the limits of her authority. Karen realized that her actions, once a source of pride and control, were now the very evidence being used against her. The Millers' lawyer highlighted key examples of harassment. One involved repeated fines for minor landscaping issues that had been corrected immediately, yet Karen had continued to send letters threatening additional penalties. Another focused on Karen's attempts to influence other neighbors, portraying the Millers as problematic to gain support for punitive measures. These examples demonstrated a clear pattern of behavior, showing that Karen's goal was not neighborhood safety or rule enforcement, but control and intimidation. Throughout the hearing, the Millers remained composed. They spoke only when necessary, answered questions clearly, and relied on the evidence they had carefully collected. Their calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Karen's increasingly agitated presence. Her overconfidence began to crack under the weight of facts, witnesses, and documented evidence. She had assumed that her authority would protect her, but in the courtroom, authority alone was meaningless without fairness and reason. The judge listened carefully to both sides, asking pointed questions about the evidence and the nature of the complaints. Karen attempted to explain her actions as necessary for maintaining community standards, but the judge noted the repeated instances of excessive fines, harassment, and intimidation. The Millers' lawyer emphasized that homeowners have rights and protections, and that Karen's actions had crossed the line, creating stress, fear, and an unjust environment. Neighbors who had attended the hearing began to understand the full extent of Karen's behavior. What had seemed like strict rule enforcement was revealed to be a campaign of control and intimidation. Whispers of surprise and concern spread quietly through the courtroom. Karen, noticing the shift in attention, tried to regain her composure, but the evidence was clear. Every document, photo, and testimony reinforced the same point. Her actions had been excessive, aggressive, and unfair. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Karen's confidence was visibly shaken. The Millers had remained calm, factual, and well-prepared, presenting a compelling case that exposed the limits of her authority. The judge indicated that a decision would be made after reviewing all evidence, but the direction was clear. Karen's overconfidence and reliance on intimidation had not achieved the result she had expected. The Millers left the courtroom feeling a mix of relief and cautious optimism. They knew the outcome was not yet final, but they were proud of how they had handled the situation. They had stood firm, relied on facts and evidence, and refused to let fear dictate their actions. Their preparation and patience had turned what seemed like a daunting battle into a situation they could manage with confidence. At home, the Millers discussed the day's events with their children. They explained that sometimes standing up for what is right requires patience, careful planning, and courage. They reassured their children that fairness and truth would ultimately prevail over intimidation and aggression. This conversation reinforced the family's resolve, reminding them that they were not only protecting their home, but also teaching their children the importance of integrity and resilience. Karen, on the other hand, returned home frustrated and unsettled. She had entered the courtroom expecting an easy victory, but the evidence and testimony had revealed that her actions were being scrutinized and challenged in ways she had not anticipated. Her overconfidence had blinded her to the careful preparation and strategy of the Millers. She began to realize that persistence and authority alone were not enough to guarantee control, especially when faced with patience, evidence, and reason. In the neighborhood, the shift in perception was subtle but noticeable. Neighbors who had previously been silent began to whisper about Karen's behavior, questioning whether her actions had been appropriate. While some remained hesitant to speak openly, the Millers' calm and strategic approach had demonstrated that standing up for fairness was possible. The dynamic in the neighborhood was changing, and Karen's influence was no longer unchallenged. As Part 4 concluded, the stage was set for the final resolution. The Millers had proven that preparation, evidence, and patience could confront even the most aggressive and overconfident adversary. Karen, while still determined, had begun to see the limits of her power and the consequences of her actions. The neighborhood had witnessed the unfolding conflict, and the story was approaching a moment where justice, fairness, and reason would finally be tested against intimidation and control. The day of the final hearing arrived, and the Millers felt a mixture of nerves and determination. For months they had prepared for this moment, gathering evidence, documenting every interaction, and quietly building support from neighbors who had witnessed Karen's actions. This was more than just a legal case, it was a stand for fairness, respect, and their right to live peacefully in their own home. Karen entered the courtroom with her usual air of confidence. She carried folders filled with letters, fines, and notes, convinced that her position on the HOA board and her history of rule enforcement would secure a victory. She believed she had already won, and that the Millers' attempts to challenge her were nothing more than a nuisance. But what she did not realize was that every letter she had sent, every complaint she had made, and every aggressive action she had taken had been carefully documented and presented in a clear, organized manner. The hearing began, and the Millers' lawyer spoke first. They presented a detailed timeline of events, showing Karen's repeated pattern of harassment and intimidation. Each complaint was addressed with supporting evidence, including photographs, copies of letters, and witness statements from neighbors who had observed Karen's behavior. The lawyer emphasized that while homeowners associations have the right to enforce rules, they do not have the right to intimidate, harass, or misuse their authority. Karen's actions had gone far beyond reasonable enforcement. Karen attempted to respond, presenting her own documents and insisting that she had acted appropriately to protect the neighborhood. She argued that the Millers were uncooperative and had ignored rules. But the judge, having reviewed the evidence, asked pointed questions about the severity and frequency of Karen's complaints. The focus shifted from the rules themselves to Karen's behavior, her persistence, her use of intimidation, and her pattern of targeting the Millers specifically. The courtroom atmosphere began to change as it became clear that Karen's actions were not about fairness, but control. Witnesses for the Millers were called one by one. Each provided detailed accounts of Karen's behavior. One neighbor described a time Karen had stormed into the street to lecture children for playing in front of their own home, insisting it violated some obscure regulation. Another neighbor recounted how Karen had pressured multiple residents to support her fines against the Millers, framing them as troublemakers to the board. Each statement painted a picture of someone who had misused her authority to create fear rather than maintain order. Karen's frustration grew as the hearing progressed. She had expected an easy victory and was unprepared for the organized presentation of facts, evidence, and witness testimony. Her voice became sharper, her interruptions more frequent, but the Millers remained calm. They answered questions clearly, presented their evidence politely, and relied on their documentation. Their calm composure contrasted sharply with Karen's agitation, making her appear increasingly unreasonable. The lawyer highlighted specific examples that captured the essence of the harassment. Letters threatening fines for minor, corrected infractions, excessive monitoring of the Millers' property, and repeated attempts to involve neighbors in her campaign were all presented as evidence of a deliberate pattern. The Millers had also kept records of Karen's tone in emails and letters, which were sometimes aggressive or insulting. All of this reinforced the argument that her actions went far beyond what could be considered fair or reasonable enforcement of rules. At one point, the judge asked Karen directly why she had escalated minor issues into repeated complaints and threats. Karen attempted to explain that she had a duty to uphold the rules and protect the neighborhood, but the judge pointed out that the pattern of her actions, sending repeated letters, issuing fines, and targeting one family relentlessly, indicated misuse of authority. Karen struggled to respond, and for the first time, her confidence wavered. The courtroom had shifted from a place where she expected control to a place where her actions were being scrutinized and challenged. The Millers' lawyer concluded by emphasizing that homeowners have the right to enjoy their property without fear of harassment. They argued that while rules are important, they must be enforced fairly and reasonably. Karen's pattern of behavior violated these principles, and allowing it to continue would set a dangerous precedent for the neighborhood. The evidence was clear, the witnesses consistent, and the Millers had presented their case with patience, preparation, and professionalism. After a brief recess, the judge returned with the decision. Karen listened, still holding on to a sense of confidence, but the tone of the courtroom had shifted. The judge began by acknowledging that rules exist for a reason and that HOA boards have a responsibility to maintain order. However, the judge emphasized that enforcement must be reasonable and fair, and it cannot be used as a tool for intimidation or harassment. The judge reviewed the evidence of repeated fines, letters, and aggressive actions taken by Karen against the Millers. It was noted that the Millers had responded promptly to any legitimate concerns, had maintained their property according to the rules, and had acted with patience and professionalism throughout the conflict. The judge pointed out that Karen's behavior went far beyond what could be considered reasonable, and that her actions had caused unnecessary stress and disruption for the Millers and the neighborhood. In the final ruling, the judge sided with the Millers. Karen was ordered to cease all harassment, to retract any unjustified fines, and to follow strict guidelines for communicating with homeowners. The ruling made it clear that HOA members cannot use their